talk, I want to share my love with TypeScript and hopefully convert you to TypeScript if you are not using it yet, or maybe show you some cool tips if you are already using it. So I'm Tomek Sułkowski. I came here from Gdynia, and I'm working at fourTheorem as a front-end developer, and also since recently I'm also a team member at StackBlitz. You might know it. So if you have any bug requests, it's not my fault because I'm fresh there. But if you have any cool ideas, talk to me. I'm also a trainer at Sages, and you can see me online at Sułko on Twitter. So maybe by the raise of hands, who here uses TypeScript? Yeah, probably a bit more than half. Who only uses JavaScript? Okay, so I think we have some Schrödinger's programmers here that are not using either. But anyway, in general, of course, every Angular developer uses TypeScript. Also, Vue, since next version will be written in TypeScript first, and React, since 3 weeks ago, also supports TypeScript officially in their main Create React app project. So other comparison, if you want to see how much TypeScript has grown recently, is if you look at the NPM downloads for just React. It of course grows as the React becomes more popular, but also types for React really started to mean something in several last months. So, couple of ideas. First of all, if you are not using TypeScript yet, and even if you don't want to migrate yet, you can already use some of its values. So if you look at this code, you might already spot a bug or two. But if you actually add a tscheck command, TypeScript will spot those errors for you. So here I'm using a string instead of a number, so let's fix that. And the second error is that I was expecting this function to return something, but because there is no implicit return here, it was also showing that error. So this is because TypeScript can infer quite a lot from the JavaScript itself, but sometimes you need some more information, and traditionally we put those informations in a JSDoc format. So if you have this format, TypeScript can also make use of that. Right, so it was supposed to return a number. And let's fix that. It's not a number yet. So, yep, that should be better. And next, if you want to migrate from JavaScript to TypeScript, in many cases, you can just do it by changing the extension, because any reasonable written JavaScript is already TypeScript compatible. One cool thing about TypeScript is also that it understands browser environment. So for example, you can see here that I'm selecting audio element, and it already knows that it is an audio element. You see this typing, there's a HTML audio element, so it will show me the possible properties and methods. And how does it know it? So let's see at the type definition. It uses element tag name map, which maps string literals to specific elements. So because I used this specific string as a selector, it knew that I'm choosing an audio element. But often you will use some other selectors, not such as simple strings. And in that case, it will not know that this is, of course, an audio element. It will instead infer that this is just some general element. And there are many of those cases. And you can always expect that this function or such a class will be also a generic. So you can actually provide the type. Oops. The second example is if you are using Angular, you've probably seen the element ref class. It's also a generic, so you can provide the element that you are using, and it will know that the native element is of given specific type. But there is also another issue here with this player element. It may really not be there on the page. Maybe we ran the script before it was rendered. So a query selector actually returns either a node element or null. And we can trigger an error here if we set in compiler options that we want strict null checks. So this is a very common problem, like this null pointer exception issue. And if you have this check, you need to provide some safety mechanism. Some safety mechanism to make sure that this element will be there. Like just checking with if. But if you turn it on, it will always complain about those kinds of situations, and sometimes you will just know from the external sources that this element will be there. So putting it in if would be a bit cumbersome. So in that case, you can use a so-called postfix operator, which is an exclamation mark, like this. So this shows this tells TypeScript that this will definitely be some value, not null or undefined. Okay. Next thing that is quite common, especially since Redux, is to use immutables. And there is no really immutable structures that you can easily create with JavaScript. Usually you can either use some external library or just believe that all the members of your team will not mutate your objects or your arrays, because those are typically the issues. So let's see how a typical problematic code would look like. I have two reducers. First is changing an object. Second one is changing an array of objects. So as you can see, I'm doing it wrong here. I'm mutating the object. Instead of providing a new one, I'm just changing the name. So I can ensure that though this object cannot be mutated if I, let's say, wrap it in a read-only interface, generic. As you can see now, the name assignment was wrong, so I need to fix it, and it's okay now. So let's see the second example with array. Again, this is not how we should do it. So we will use read-only array generic. And read-only array is basically an array without any mutational methods. So you can have slice, but you can't have splice, for example. Yep, let's fix it. Okay, it's fixed. Next common scenario is you have some big JSON response. Maybe you're using some external undocummented API. And this is actually one of the examples from my trainings. We're using an API that returns me an information about TV show. And this is quite a big object. And what I used to do is I would just copy this into my TypeScript file, say that this is an interface, and would just manually say that image is an object that has a medium, which is a string, original string, like quite a few minutes of manual labor. And I would end up with this huge interface, huge nested interface, which is not really reusable, because probably I would want this image thing to also be an interface. So ideally, it should be a set of small, like flat interfaces. So this is something that machines really are good to use. So you can use this Visual Code extension. Then if you just copy the JSON response and use Ctrl-Shift-V, it will create all the interfaces for you. So yeah, so a few minutes of break maybe for you. And this is code by JSON as code, and you can actually use it with other languages as well. If you are using like Swift or Java, you can generate some other structures from it. If you are using a TypeScript, you probably know that any is your enemy. So you should avoid it by any cost. So for example, here I also have a problematic code. And the first thing that I usually do is in tsconfig, I decide that I don't want to have implicit any's. So it will, in that case, I will need to fix that typing error in the parameter. But the other issue is with this return type of this function. So this is something that I stumble upon a lot. I always forget to type a return. And there is nothing in TypeScript, in tsconfig, that actually can restrict or can tell me to always type return functions. So for a long time, it was an issue for me. So sorry, let's fix that. What was this? No implicit any. And first thing I would do is I would try to remember that I just need to add the return type. But there is another issue here. I'm not getting what I was expecting. So TypeScript will basically infer the return type every time, so it just knows better than me even what happens here, what are the type transformations. So it knows that I'm returning actually a string here. Right? So it would be good to have this requirement to always type return what the function returns. And this is where tslint is helpful, because there is a specific rule in tslint that can help you with this. Right? This is the type def, and we need to provide always a call signature. As you can see, TypeScript now, tslint complains that I don't provide what the method returns. All right, yeah, so this is the error. Next tip is that type guards are your friends, and they will help you, and it's good to know that they are there. So let's say my API returns me two kinds of objects from the same like response. I can have either a singer that is of type singer. So there is a like string with value of string of singer, or instrumentalist that is of type of player. So I will prepare some union type to make it a bit more easy to use. And I'll create a function that, for example, needs to log some information about both type of objects. So as you can see right now, I only have the common properties. Also, TypeScript knows that the type can have only one of those two values, so player or singer. And if I provide a check, so if I check if type of my object is player, let's say, oh, singer, okay, it will now know that I'm in this singer interface. So it will also show me the vocal range. And also it will know that this if statement, because we had the return, it took care of that first option, and the only option that remains is to be instrumentalist. And the last, and probably one of the most powerful tips, and I think one of the least used, is to use never type. How many of you have used never? 6 or 7 people. Yes. So I hope you will at least learn that, if all the other things you already knew. So the never type is the type that can only be assigned to another never. So we basically need to write a condition that should never happen. So because I have this switch statement that takes care of first, second option, but it didn't took care of the third one, there can be a situation where it still goes through. So I'll create this impossible state. Right? And you can see that genres metal is not assignable to never. So it figured out that that's the one value that came through, but it shouldn't. There is no possibility for it to assign to never. So this is how you implement this never. And what it will now give you is assurance that you handled all the other cases, which again, for example, with Redux is pretty useful thing to have. Right? No error anymore. All right, so if you want to learn more, one of the best resources I use constantly is Gitbook. If you just Google TypeScript Gitbook, there is this one, a nice overview. It starts with ES6 even, then goes into TypeScript. And if you are writing React and want to use TypeScript in there, there is a TypeScript guide for React and Redux. Quite useful thing. And I quite often publish some of these kind of tips, like 20, 30-second tips on TypeScript and ES6 on my Twitter again. So I encourage you to follow me. And that's it.